I've gotten a lot of reports from students who took the LSAT today all saying the same thing, that logical reasoning felt different. Not just harder or more stressful, but different in how it demanded attention. And the way that people are describing it matters. They're not saying the questions were confusing. They're saying the logic was harder to keep organized, that the arguments felt denser and relationships stacked up more often. And several questions felt like mini logic games hiding inside ordinary paragraphs. And so when that kind of feedback shows up independently and repeatedly, it's not a coincidence. It's indicating that the emphasis of this section has shifted. And so today, I'm going to break down exactly what that shift looks like inside logical reasoning, why it showed up so clearly on today's LSAT, and how to train yourself so it stops being a liability if you're taking the LSAT in the next few months or beyond. Now, what changed in logical reasoning is not that the LSAT suddenly introduced new question types. You're still seeing the same old types: necessary assumption, flaw, inference, strengthen, weaken, parallel, principle, method of reasoning, and so on. But what did change is how much logical structure you are expected to manage at once. Earlier versions of logical reasoning over the past few decades would often present one central move or one key assumption or one gap that you could isolate quickly. But today's LSAT leaned more towards arguments where you had multiple elements interacting with each other, overlapping conditions, conclusions that depended on more than one relationship being tracked correctly. So you could understand each sentence in isolation, but still lose track of the argument as a whole. And that creates a different kind of difficulty that taxes your working memory that goes beyond the limits of normal working memory. And the reason this shift is happening is because of the removal of the logic games section, starting with the August 2024 LSAT. Back when you had logic games on the test, you would have conditional chains, interacting rules, constrained hypotheticals, and system level thinking. Now, when LSAC was forced to remove the logic games section due to a lawsuit, those skills did not just disappear from the LSAT entirely. LSAC shifted the focus of the LSAT to incorporate those concepts into the logical reasoning section instead. So, in other words, LSAC has moved formal logic into logical reasoning by embedding it inside arguments instead of isolating it inside a more diagramming friendly section. And so today's LSAT is yet another clear confirmation that this is a deliberate move. So these aren't necessarily just feeling like harder questions. They feel like you've got to hold more information in your head before committing to a choice. And you might feel unsure even when the argument seems reasonable. Now, let's break down the main trap families or the main question types that are driving this experience. Many questions on today's LSAT included conditional logic that was layered rather than isolated. So you had a conditional paired with an exception, or necessary conditions hidden behind phrases like requires or depends upon, or conditionals that apply to subgroups, not the entire argument. And the danger here is not misunderstanding the language, it's treating one condition as if it controls the entire argument. And so your response to facing this has got to be procedural and rules driven rather than intuitive, meaning that you've got to have a step-by-step approach because these are going to break the limits of what you can handle or hold in your head all at once. And so you got to know whether the conditionals are creating a chain or a fork or a bottleneck. And you don't want to take the contrapositive for every single statement because you just aren't going to have time for that. Now, you've also got to look for more subtle logical gaps, the kind of arguments with gaps that are easy to overlook. And so you might have conclusions that quietly expand the scope of what you're dealing with, or claims about improvement or decline without a fixed baseline, or evaluations without a defined standard. Or they might want you to generalize based on a sample that is just too narrow or unrepresentative. And so the trap here is choosing an answer that feels relevant but does not repair the exact weakness. And so to avoid this, you've got to reduce every argument to three parts. First, what the evidence establishes. Two, what the conclusion claims. And three, what must be true in order for the leap to work. And if you can't state the missing link precisely, the choices are going to feel interchangeable. Now, the third question type you want to look for is quantitative logic that is disguised as common sense. Now, numbers and percentages played a larger role on today's LSAT than in the past, but the math itself isn't difficult and it's not really anything new. You're looking at percentage changes without stable denominators or raw totals presented without population context or rates that shift because the group changed or averages that move due to composition, not performance. And so LSAC is relying on speed here. And students assume that numbers are objective and they rush beyond what they should. And so the correct approach here is to interrogate the structure of the argument and the scope of what you're dealing with. So is this percentage, is it a raw number, or is it a rate of change? And what is the denominator, or what is the size of the group? Is that group consistent over time? Or does the conclusion exceed what the data supports? Now, this shift in the LSAT over the past couple of years is going to penalize students who rely on familiarity, and it's going to reward those who rely on structure. Recognizing a question type is no longer enough, and understanding the words themselves is also no longer enough. The LSAT now rewards your discipline in evaluating formal logic, your ability to track relationships, your resistance to intuitive shortcuts, and your ability to stay precise under time pressure. That's why today's LSAT felt so different. And so if you're taking the LSAT soon, you've got to adjust your preparation, and your priorities matter. First, you've got to be able to interpret formal logic automatically. You've got to be able to translate conditionals quickly and recognize when interactions exist. Second, your ability to spot assumptions has to be precise. You want to practice articulating and pre-phrasing the exact gap in the argument before getting into the answer choices. And your ability to interpret quantity-related logic, you've got to train that deliberately. You've got to treat numbers as arguments, not calculations. And know that these questions have appeared on the LSAT ever since the beginning of the LSAT, or at least the modern format starting in June 1991. They're just appearing with increased prevalence on the modern LSAT now, ever since the removal of the logic game section. So there's plenty of these to study from the previous exams. And you've got to know how to execute under timed conditions. So know when to skip, when to avoid getting bogged down or stuck, because you don't want to let one dense question consume the entire section and waste your time. So it's all about how you reallocate your attention given the changes to the LSAT. Now, your review process is key. Every time you review, you should extract a key rule or insight that you can apply to your studying in the future. So instead of saying, I should have read more carefully, you want takeaways like, I treated a necessary condition as a sufficient condition, I ignored a scope shift, I assumed a percentage change reflected raw totals, or I addressed the premise instead of the gap. And then for every question you missed, every question you were uncertain of, you've got to write down the conclusion, the evidence, the precise gap, the kind of trap that you fell for, and the course correction going forward. That's how you turn your experiences into pattern recognition. Now, today's LSAT really shouldn't have been unpredictable because although it was structured differently from many of the released LSAT exams, these changes have been on the LSAT for the past year and a half or more, going on more and more over time, more focus on numbers and percentages, more focus on quantitative reasoning, conditional logic. And so students who keep preparing the old way using outdated textbooks and courses are going to get surprised again and again. But students who adapt using modern, up-to-date materials, getting live support for the latest LSAT changes, are going to find this version of the LSAT actually more controllable rather than less. And your ability to control your prep, to take charge of your prep, is going to be what produces high scores.